Let's begin today by saying what our objective is. It's simply to be able to multiply and divide negative numbers. We want to know what happens when we want to multiply and divide numbers that include a negative sign. So here's a clue. What does it mean to multiply 3 by 7? If we want to say 7 times 3 or 3 times 7, what we're really doing is addition. So I would say normally 7 times 3 is really 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3, okay? Which is a little bit boring even to say it, isn't it? So we don't want to have to say, can you give me 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3? That would just take too long. It's not very quick. It's boring. So we just say, can you tell me what 7 3s are? So we get the same answer. We get the multiplication bit on the left, but it actually means addition on the right. So multiplication is really a shorthand way of doing addition. Now we get the same result, 21. If you add up 7 3s, you get 21. If you say 7 times 3 on a calculator, you get 21. What about negative numbers? Can we do the same thing? What can I do with 7 minus 3s? Is it going to work the same way as 7 plus 3s? Well, yes. If I take a minus 3, add a minus 3, add a minus 3, add a minus 3, up to 7 of them, I'll get minus 21. That makes sense, doesn't it? I'm treating it exactly the same way in terms of process. All I've done is take all the 3s and add them together and stick a negative on the front. I'm going to say that in words. If I take away minus 3 7 times, I'll end up taking away 21, which is the equivalent of minus 21 because it's a takeaway, not an addition. So let's examine the multiplication just again, one more time. I'm going to put down 1 times 3, and you know and I know that 1 times 3 is 3. Yes? Yes. Okay, the numbers 1 and 3 are factors of 3, because 1 goes into 3 3 times, and 3 goes into 3 1 time, doesn't it? Now, What are the factors of minus 3? We could say we've still got the 1 and the 3. So there's still going to be a 1 and a 3 involved because 1 goes into 3 3 times and 3 goes in once. But we've got this complication of the negative sign. So we've got to write that in somehow. And what we're going to do is this. We could have a 1 times a minus 3. So 1 is a factor and minus 3 is a factor. Or we could have minus 1 is a factor and 3 is a factor. Because 3 times minus 1 will give us a minus 3. And minus 1 times 3 will also give us a minus 3. The 1 times minus 3 still means the same as minus 1 times 3. I could have one lot of minus 3. I'll take away 3 pounds off you. Take away 3. Or I could take away once 3 times. I could say, I'm going to take £1 off you now, £1 off you in a minute's time, and another £1 a minute after that. I still take away 3, don't I? In other words, minus 1 is a factor of minus 3. Minus 3 is a factor of minus 3. And minus 1 is a factor of minus 3. Okay, let me move on. Minus 1 can change the sign of a number. Why do I mean that? Well, to do this, all we have to do is multiply a number by minus 1 and we'll change its sign. Let's take 5 times minus 1. 5 is a positive, yes?
Yeah.
Times it by minus 1, you end up with a negative 5. What I've done is I've kept the negative because I've got one positive in front of the 5. We don't write that down usually. I've got the negative in front of the 1. 5 times 1 is still 5, but I've got to keep the negative. What this is really saying is I'm going to take a 1 away from you. You owe me 1. I'm going to take it away 5 times. So how much did I take away? I took away 5. So the right-hand side says I took away 5 in total. The left-hand side says I took it away in dollops of 1. If that's true, 7 times minus 1 equals minus 7. And 10 times minus 1 is minus 10. So what this is doing, I'm multiplying by minus 1, I'm taking a positive number, I'm multiplying it by a minus 1 to get a negative number. That's all that's happening. The minus 1 is turning a positive number into a negative number. Now let's take this idea and we'll try and use it on a number line. All right, I'm going to start off with a number on this line of 3. Can you see I've got 3 up here? Now I'm going to assume that minus 1 times 3 will give me a minus 3. That a negative 1 times a 3 will turn the positive into a negative. And what's really happening here is I'm multiplying by minus 1 and I'm switching the number from the right hand side of the line to the negative side of the line. I'm switching it from the plus 3 to the minus 3. All I'm doing is I'm moving it to the other side, like a mirror image of it. I'm moving it to the other side of the line by multiplying by minus 1. Now that's quite a significant jump, isn't it? Because I've gone from 3 to minus 3, which is a difference of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's not a small change. That's a big change to go from plus 3 to minus 3. And all I've done is multiply by minus 1. And in English, we'd say multiplying a number by minus 1 makes the number more negative and switches the number from the positive side of the number line to the negative side. Now let's just take that one step further. Let's suppose I had a negative 3 and I multiplied by a minus 1. So I'm going to take a minus 1 and multiply a negative number. In this case, remember the rule, if you multiply by a minus, I'm going to switch the sign of the number. So the number will go the other way. It ends up at 3. In other words, I'm saying when we multiply a negative by a negative, we switch the number back to the positive side of the number line. Or we say we make it more positive. So we can switch it both ways. We can start off with a positive multiplied by minus 1, and it switches to the negative side of the line. If I multiply by minus 1 on the negative, it switches it to the positive side of the line. Or in simple arithmetic terms, a minus 1 multiplying a negative 3 will give me a plus 3. A negative negative gives me a positive. So I can go both ways. Now, let me just go back to the previous slide for a minute. The previous slide said that a negative multiplied by a positive gives me a negative. A negative times a positive gives me a negative. It switches it from being a positive number to a negative number. The new one says that if you take a negative and multiply it by a negative, you'll actually end up with a positive. And we can start putting these ideas together now, okay? So the rules for multiplying turn out to be the following. If you take a 3 times 5 as our example, we end up with 15. Now, unwritten here is the fact that these are positive numbers. So we actually end up with a plus 3 multiplied by a plus 5 gives me a plus 15. Or a plus times a plus gives me a plus. So in simple terms, I can write that down as 2 positives gives me a positive. Let's take the negative number. I'm going to take a negative 3 and multiply it by a 5, and I'll end up with actually negative 15. What's really going on here? What's really going on is I've got a minus 1 times a plus 3. This minus 3 is really a minus 1 times 3. So I've taken the minus 1 outside and left the 3 on the inside. So I end up with a positive 3 multiplied by a positive 5. Now a positive 3 times a positive 5 will give me a positive 15. The minus 1 is now outside. So this minus 3 was really a minus 1 times a 3. Remember, a minus 1 is a factor of minus 3. So I've got a minus 1 on the outside, a plus 15 on the inside. A minus times a plus will give me a minus times a plus will give me a minus. So there's our second rule, that a negative will always give me a negative. One negative on its own, multiplied by anything else, one negative on its own, I got one negative here, will give me a negative. Now, the next one's easier because I'll switch it round. I'll make the 5 negative and the 3 positive, and I'll get the same result for the same reason, that I take the minus 1 outside from the negative 5. The negative 5 is really a 5 times a negative 1. So I'll take the negative 1 outside. I end up with 3 and 5 inside, which will give me 15 again. So I'm going to get a negative gives me a negative again. So the second rule and the third rule are really the same rule. A single negative on its own, multiplied by a positive, will give me a negative. The last one is the key one here. A negative 3 times a negative 5 will give me a positive 15. And what's happening here is I've actually got a negative on the 3, so I've taken that outside. I've got a negative on the 5, I've taken that outside. So I've got a negative 1 and a negative 1. I put those together and I end up with a negative 1 times a negative 1, and the 3 and the 5 are inside being positive. They're going to give me 15 again. But a negative times a negative, we said, will give us a positive. So I end up with a plus 1 times a 3 times 5. Well, 3 times 5 is 15, and times it by 1 is still going to give me 15. Let's just move it across there. So 3 times 5 is 15. And believe it or not, that's really the same problem as the first one. I've ended up with 3 times 5 again, 3 times 5. Now, that means
Yeah.
these two particular settings here, 2 positives gives me a positive and 2 negatives gives me a positive as well, is the basic rule. Anything else will be a negative, okay? 2 positives multiplied together will always give you a positive. We knew that. But now we have this additional rule that 2 negatives will also give you a positive. So can we now apply the same rules to division? Well, of course we can. If we take 8 divided by 4, a positive 8 divided by a positive 4, you will tell me it's a positive 2, yeah? The way we'd normally write that down on a piece of paper, if we were writing it as a fraction, it would be 8 over 4. So plus 8 divided by plus 4 gives me the 2. Right, so let's just try this a little bit different. 2 positives gives us a positive. A positive divided by a positive gives us a positive. Positive 4 divided by a positive 4 gives me a positive 2. Right, let's just try the next bit now. I'm going to take a negative 8 and divide it by a positive 4. And as it turns out, it's going to be a minus 2. Let's just see what that means in reality. I've got a negative 8 divided by a positive 4. The rule here is that one negative gives us a negative, just like in multiplication. If I have one negative and one positive, I end up with a negative. Let's try the last one here. 8 divided by a minus 4. Well, all I've done is taken the minus off the 8 and put it on the minus 4. So I end up with a minus 2. I still end up with the same minus 2. The way we look at it in terms of a fraction is plus 8 divided by minus 4. We get the same rule. One negative gives us a negative. And last but not least, a negative 8 divided by negative 4 equals 2. In other words, if we put it down in terms of fractions, minus 8 divided by minus 4, and negative divided by negative will give us 2 negatives, and 2 negatives will give us a positive. Now, so I don't know if you can see it, but we've actually got the same rules as we had for multiplication. 2 positives gives us a positive, and 2 negatives gives us a positive as well. So if you know the rule for multiplication, you apply exactly the same rule when you're dividing. And if I just write over here what this minus 8 really means, I'm going to take that up there for you to see. And minus 8 is the same as minus 1 times 8. So if I've got minus 8 over 4, we take this to minus 8 over 4, I'm going to end up with minus 1 multiplied by 8 over 4. Now the 8 over 4 bit's easy. That's just back to 2 again. But I'm multiplying it by a minus 1. If I take that down there for the space, equals minus 1 times 2. A minus times a plus will give me a minus. I end up with minus 2. So that's why it works, because this 8 here, a factor of 8, is the minus 1. I can rewrite minus 8 as minus 1 times 8, divide the plus 8 by the 4 to get the 2, and then stick the minus back in front. As soon as I got a minus 1 on its own, just single minus, it turns the plus 2 to a minus 2. It switches it from one side of the number line to the other. 2 negatives gives us a positive. Minus 8 over minus 4 is really minus 1 times 8 over minus 1 times 4. So if I've got a minus 1 divided by a minus 1, they cancel each other out. So I'm left with 8 over 4. Which of course returns a value of 2, as expected. So a negative divided by a negative will always give me a positive, for that very reason. So 2 negatives do give us a positive. It's a bit like you start off on the number line, you switch it from right to left, and then left back to right, so nothing changes. You've done it twice. You've gone negative once, negative twice. It neutralizes each other. The minus 1 and the minus 1 knock each other out. Let's try this combination now. We try a combination of multiplication and division in one number. So I've got this number here, minus 3 times 8 over minus 2. So the top numbers are multiplied, and they're going to be divided by the number at the bottom. So let's rewrite that now in terms of our minus 1, okay? So this is going to be equal to a minus 1 times the 3, because a minus 3 is really a minus 1 times 3 times 8, and the minus 2 is really a minus 1 times 2. That's how you get a 2 to be a minus 2. You multiply it by minus 1. I've got a minus 1 on the top line. I've got a minus 1 on the bottom line. What's going to happen to those two numbers? So they'll just basically knock each other out. In which case, I'm left with 3 times 8 over 2. 3 times 8 is 24, so it'll become 24 over 2. And 24 divided by 2 gives me 12. So my negative numbers, in this case, had no impact on my final answer. The two negatives knocked each other out. Doesn't matter where they are. If you've got two negatives anywhere in that combination, whether they're multiplying or dividing, if you've got two negatives, they'll knock each other out. You'll end up with a positive number. So I'm going to clear the screen down here, and I'm going to plug a number in here. So I'm going to put in -3 times by 8, divide by -2. I've got a negative there, a -2 and a -3. I multiply them together and I end up with a +12. Now let's really understand what's going on here. So I got -3, -1 times 3 times 8 divided by brackets -1 times 2 close brackets. So I got a -1 in front of the +3 because a -1 times 3 gives me a -3. I've got a -1 in front of the 2 because a -1 times 2 gives me -2, and I should get the same answer 12. Yes, I get the same answer 12. So that's really what's going on. Okay. Now if you count it, I've still only got two negatives. I've got a negative here, I've got a negative there. Two negatives make me a positive. Now let's just try what happens if I put a -3 times a -8 divided by a -2. -3 times -8 divided by a -2. A -3 times a -8 divided by a -2. What do you predict the answer will be?
That'd be positive, but then it's another negative.
Well, what's the number going to be first? What's the number going to be? So I've got 3 8 to 24, and 24 divided by 2 should give me 12, yes? So if we look very carefully, we can see we've got three negative operators, an odd number of negative signs. Therefore, we're going to end up with a negative in front of our final number. An even number of negatives would give us a positive number, an odd number will give us a negative. Let's try another example, shall we? So I'll put in a -2 multiplied by a -5. We'll divide that lot by, and I'll open up a brackets to make it clear what I'm doing, a -2 multiplied by another -2 and close the bracket. Now let's try and predict what the number will be first. We'll have a 2 times 5 on the top line, which will give us 10, and a 2 times 2 on the bottom line in the denominator, which will give us a 4. So that's 10 divided by 4. We can simplify that as 5 divided by 2 by dividing top and bottom by 2. So the question is it going to be a +5 divided by 2 or a -5 divided by 2? Now 5 divided by 2 in decimals is 2.5. If we look at the number of negatives in front of the numbers, we've got an even number of negatives. And we should predict that an even number of negatives will give us a positive result, 2.5. Now, if I go back up to that number again and I change it, because you can see it on the screen, I'm going to change it. I'm going to change that from a negative to a positive, okay? I'm going to delete that so it's a positive. So I've got three negatives. Predict the answer. So in this case, we have an odd number of negatives, and we predict with an odd number we'll end up with a -2.5. So our general rule for multiplying and dividing negative numbers is going to be to multiply the numbers and divide them first, carry out that normal set of operations, and when you're finished, go back and count up the number of negatives in front of the numbers. Doesn't matter whether they're above or below the line. And then simply say, if it's an odd number, my end number, my result will be negative. If it's an even number of negatives, my end result will be positive. So in summary, what we're saying is a combination of an even number of negatives will result in a positive final answer, whereas a combination of an odd number of negatives will result in a negative final answer. So finally, to test out your newfound knowledge on negative numbers, and particularly with respect to multiplication and division, you can try out exercise 1E on page 217 in your textbook.